Sergeant Jake Calloway woke to the same dull ache in his ribs, the ghost of an old injury from a war that no longer mattered. The flickering light of his apartment's faulty ceiling fan cast shadows on the peeling wallpaper, and the air smelled of burnt coffee and stale regret. He swung his legs over the bed, feeling the stiffness in his joints, and sighed. Another day, another reminder that heroes didn't get happy endings, just overdue bills and bad knees. The knock at the door came just as he lit the first cigarette of the morning. 3 precise raps, too deliberate for a landlord demanding rent. He hesitated before opening it, finding himself face to face with something distinctly not human. The figure was tall, draped in a uniform that shimmered in a color his brain struggled to name. Its face, sleek and angular, bore the cold detachment of someone who considered Earth a pit stop rather than a place of interest. Sergeant Calloway. The alien's voice carried the sterile crispness of an automated message. Depends who's asking. A metallic case extended toward him, its surface humming faintly with energy. You have been named the recipient of an inheritance from Prince Varkos of the Zenithian Empire. Terms are non-negotiable. Jake scoffed, arms crossed. I don't know any damn prince. Regardless, the contract is binding. The alien stepped aside, revealing a transport hovering at the curb. 2 more figures emerged, guiding a large, coffin-like stasis pod onto the cracked pavement. Frost clung to the glass as mechanical arms disengaged the locks. The pod hissed, releasing a burst of cold air, and the creature inside stirred. Jake took an involuntary step back. A massive wolf, its fur an unnatural shade of pure white, lay curled within the capsule. Its body bore scars that crisscrossed over lean muscle, and a collar of some alien metal sat snug against its thick neck. But it was the eyes that unsettled him most, glowing, unervingly intelligent, and fixed straight on him. The wolf rose to its feet, stretching with a slow, deliberate motion. Then, in perfect English, it spoke. "Great," it muttered, shaking out its fur. Another human. Jake nearly reached for the pistol under his jacket. "What the hell?" The wolf yawned, bearing a mouthful of canines that looked like they could sever bone. "Let's get one thing straight. I didn't ask to be here, either. But since the alternative is rotting in a Zenithian research lab, I'll take my chances." Jake turned to the courier, who remained impassive. "You want to explain why a talking wolf just fell into my lap?" The alien merely nodded toward the case in Jake's hands. "All information is inside. Our business is concluded." Before he could argue, the courier returned to the transport, and within seconds, they were gone, leaving Jake alone with the beast. Rael, that was the name embedded in the digital documents within the case. A genetically engineered warhound from a bloodline designed for combat, Rael had been bred to be the perfect soldier. But something had gone wrong. According to the files, the prince had discarded him, citing a failure to comply with imperial conditioning. Jake didn't need to read between the lines to figure it out. The wolf was too independent, too much of a risk, a failed experiment. Jake tossed the tablet onto the table, rubbing his temples. "So what? The prince screws up, and I'm stuck babysitting his reject." Rael snorted. "You think I enjoy this arrangement? The last thing I need is a washed-up human playing caretaker. Watch it, furball. I could dump you on the street. You could try." The wolf's eyes glinted. "But you won't." Jake glared at him. "And why's that?" Rael took a slow step forward, the weight of his presence filling the tiny apartment. "Because I see it in your eyes. You're just as unwanted as I am." The word struck a nerve, but Jake refused to let it show. He grabbed a beer from the fridge instead, twisting the cap off with more force than necessary. He didn't need some alien mutt psychoanalyzing him. "Fine, you can stay, but don't expect me to roll out the welcome mat." Rael huffed, settling onto the floor with a grace that seemed at odds with his bulk. "Trust me, Sergeant, I wouldn't dream of it." Hours passed in uneasy silence. Jake tried to ignore the fact that he now shared his home with a creature that looked like it belonged in a war zone, not in a run-down apartment on Earth. Rael, for his part, remained still, only his ears twitching at the occasional creak of the old building. When night fell, Jake finally spoke. "You got a plan? Or are you just planning to freeload?" Rael didn't open his eyes. Survival is my plan. Same as yours. Jake scoffed. I don't need to survive. I just need to get through the damn day. A pause. Then, Rael lifted his head. Maybe that's the problem. Jake didn't have an answer for that. Instead, he turned off the lights, knowing full well he wouldn't sleep. Jake adjusted the strap of his duffel bag as he stepped into the damp alley behind his apartment building. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the ground was still slick, reflecting the neon glow of a broken street lamp. Rael padded beside him, his white fur stark against the darkness, moving with a silence that made Jake uneasy. 3 days had passed since the wolf arrived, and while they weren't exactly friends, an unspoken truce had formed between them. Jake had spent years surviving on scraps, taking whatever work he could find, security gigs, repair jobs, even the occasional underground fight for a handful of credits. Tonight was supposed to be simple. Meet a contact, get paid, and keep the landlord off his back for another month. But things never stayed simple. You're tense, Rael observed, his voice carrying an edge of amusement. Jake exhaled. Old habit. The alley opened into a side street where a lone figure waited under the glow of a flickering sign. The man was short, wrapped in layers of patched fabric, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. Jake recognized him. Kessler, a low-level fixer who brokered deals between people who wanted things done and people desperate enough to do them. You got what I asked for? Jake didn't bother with pleasantries. Kessler nodded, pulling a small package from his coat. Microcell battery, military grade. Fresh off a wrecked Zenithian scout ship. He hesitated, gaze flicking to Rael. Didn't know you had company. Not your problem, Jake said flatly. Kessler handed over the package, but as soon as Jake's fingers closed around it, the fixer's eyes widened in sudden fear. Shit, he whispered. They found you. A distant hum filled the air, faint but growing louder. Rael's ears flicked toward the sound first, his muscles tensing. Then, without warning, a streak of red light cut through the night and struck the pavement inches from Jake's foot. Moo! Rael barked. Jake barely had time to register the warning before the alley exploded into motion. 3 figures emerged from the shadows, their armor reflecting the ambient neon. Zenithian bounty hunters. Their sleek helmets glowed with pulsing blue visors, and in their hands, they held plasma carbines, standard issue for mercenaries with imperial backing. Jake dove behind a rusted dumpster, cursing under his breath. Any reason these guys would be after you? Rael crouched low, his hackles rising. The prince doesn't leave loose ends. A second blast scorched the metal beside Jake's head, filling the air with the acrid scent of burning paint. He gritted his teeth. He wasn't armed for this. Rael, however, was built for it. With a snarl, the wolf launched himself into the fray, closing the distance between him and the nearest attacker in a blink. The merc barely had time to react before Rael's claws tore through his chest plate, sending him crashing into the wall. The second bounty hunter turned his rifle toward Rael, but Jake was already moving. He surged forward, using the butt of the battery pack to knock the gun from the mercenary's hands before driving his knee into his ribs. The third attacker hesitated, realizing too late that this wasn't an easy payday. Rael whipped around, his glowing eyes locking onto the bounty hunter with a cold, calculated fury. Tell your prince, the wolf growled, that I'm not his property. The hunter bolted. Jake exhaled, shaking out his bruised knuckles. Great. Now we're officially on the Empire's shit list. Rael nudged the fallen merc with his paw, ensuring he wasn't getting back up. You were never off it. Kessler, who had wisely ducked behind a stack of crates, peeked out with wide, terrified eyes. You idiots just started a war. Jake ran a hand through his hair, already feeling the weight of what came next. He knew what the Empire did to those who crossed it. He'd fought their forces before, had seen entire colonies wiped out for less than this. And now, thanks to Rael, he was marked for death on every mercenary board in the galaxy. We need to get off-world, Jake muttered. Rael nodded. Agreed. Kessler swallowed hard. I might know someone who can help, but it won't be cheap. Jake checked the mercenaries' bodies for anything useful. He found a half-charged plasma pistol and a data chip. Not much, but enough. We'll manage, he said. Rael glanced up at the sky, where the faint glow of distant ships flickered against the city haze. They'll come in greater numbers next time. Jake followed his gaze, knowing he was right. There was no going back now. No quiet life, no scraping by. If they wanted to live, they had to disappear. And if Prince Varkos wanted them dead, he was about to find out what happened when you backed a soldier and a warhound into a corner. The stolen freighter rattled as it cut through the upper atmosphere, engines straining against the weight of its illicit cargo. Jake tightened his grip on the controls, his pulse steady despite the flashing warnings on the console. Rael sat beside him, eyes fixed on the void ahead, his breath slow and measured. They had escaped Earth with nothing but borrowed time and a bounty large enough to turn half the galaxy against them. The only safe harbor left was a place neither of them had ever seen, a sanctuary whispered about in war stories. The Maw. The Maw wasn't on any official star charts. It existed in the spaces between territories, a drifting station of exiled warriors, mercenaries, and deserters from 100 different wars. Rael had spoken of it in quiet tones, his voice laced with something almost reverent. The old ones were there, he'd said. The Warhounds that had refused the Empire's leash. If they wanted to live, they needed allies. And if they wanted to win, they needed an army. The ship lurched as it exited hyperspace, the massive station looming before them like the carcass of some ancient beast. Wreckage from forgotten battles drifted in its orbit, a silent warning to those who came uninvited. The docking request was answered with nothing but coordinates, a silent acknowledgement that they were being watched. As the freighter settled into the hangar, Jake felt the weight of unseen eyes on him. The air here was thick with the scent of oil, rust, and ozone. The moment the ramp lowered, figures emerged from the shadows, warriors draped in scavenged armor, weapons strapped to their backs. And among them stood something Jake had never seen before. The Warhounds. They were larger than Rael, their fur streaked with battle scars, their eyes burning with an eerie, unnatural glow. The one who stepped forward bore a jagged cybernetic limb, its metal plating fused with old wounds. He studied Rael in silence, then spoke in a voice like grinding stone. You should not exist. Rael met his gaze without flinching. And yet I do. The others shifted, low growls passing between them. These were creatures bred for war, molded by an empire that had turned on them. Jake recognized their stance, the way soldiers tested one another before deciding whether to kill or kneel. He had seen it in every battlefield, in every ruined city where the strong had learned to survive. The Warhound leader took a slow step forward, his gaze flicking toward Jake. And the human? Rael's answer was immediate. He is mine, as I am his. Something passed between them in that moment, something unspoken but understood. The leader let out a short, approving huff before turning on his heel. Then follow. We have much to discuss. The Maw's heart was a sprawling war room built from scavenged technology, its walls lined with stolen imperial weaponry. Tactical maps flickered with shifting data, holograms displaying fleet movements and mercenary bounties. The Warhounds had not spent their exile in idleness. They had been waiting. Jake listened as Rael spoke with the elders, telling them of Prince Varkos's plans, of the Empire's fear that a single rogue warhound could inspire rebellion. The old warriors did not laugh. They understood too well what fear could do to an empire built on control. You seek war, one of them said. Rael shook his head. I seek justice. Jake leaned forward, his fingers drumming against the table. Call it whatever you want, but if we don't move first, Varkos will send more than mercenaries next time. He'll send an armada. The Warhounds exchanged glances. They had seen the same war Jake had, even if they had fought it with tooth and claw instead of rifles. And in war, there was only one truth. You struck before your enemy had a chance. The decision was made in silence. Preparation was immediate. Jake walked the station's corridors, watching as weapons were checked, ships readied, old armor repaired. The Warhounds moved with the quiet efficiency of creatures who had fought for survival their entire lives. It was strange seeing them like this, not as imperial weapons, not as abandoned outcasts, but as warriors choosing their own fate. Rael approached him near the hangar, his fur streaked with oil from helping repair one of the assault ships. "You don't have to stay for this." Jake snorted. "Like hell I don't." Rael tilted his head. "You came here for survival." Jake exhaled, watching the flickering lights of the station above them. "I came here because I had nowhere else to go. But this is something I understand." He turned, meeting Rael's gaze. "I fought for men who didn't deserve it. I followed orders that led to nothing but graves. But this, fighting to take down the bastard who put a bounty on my head, that's personal." Rael studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we fight." The battle began at the edge of the system, where Varkos's fleet had gathered to crush the last of the resistance before it could take root. They hadn't expected an ambush. They hadn't expected ghosts from their own past to return for vengeance. The Maw's forces moved like a storm, Warhounds launching from attack ships, boarding vessels cutting through imperial hulls like serrated teeth. Jake led a squad through the chaos, his rifle steady, his mind clear in a way it hadn't been in years. There was no hesitation, no doubt. He fought like a soldier who had found something worth fighting for. And at the center of it all was Rael, tearing through enemy lines with the precision of something built for war, but fighting with the fury of something that had chosen it. They breached the command ship's bridge together. Varkos stood waiting, draped in ceremonial armor, his expression unreadable. He did not look surprised. "I should have had you destroyed," the prince said, eyes locked on Rael. Rael's voice was calm. "You tried." Varkos moved first, striking with a blade humming with crackling energy. Rael dodged, his body moving in a blur, his claws slicing through the air. Jake fired, forcing Varkos to pivot, and in that moment, Rael struck. His teeth closed around the prince's throat, pinning him against the cold metal floor. Varkos struggled, but it was over. His empire had built the Warhounds to be perfect weapons, and in the end, that perfection had turned on him. Rael didn't kill him. That choice he left to the Warhounds, to the ones who had suffered the most beneath his rule. As they walked away from the fallen prince, Jake exhaled, feeling the weight of it all settle in his bones. He wasn't sure what came next. He wasn't sure what kind of future could be built from the ruins of the past. But as Rael fell into step beside him, the Warhounds rallying behind them, Jake knew one thing for certain. They weren't running anymore.